Everybody, thank you so much for joining us today for the A&A eLearning Academy. Today we've got Doug Mudd, a buddy of mine here at the A&A, who is going to be presenting on the propaganda of Civil War, specifically the numismatic legacy of the English Civil Wars. Everyone's going to be muted for this presentation, so if you guys have questions, please put them in the chat box or the Q&A. I'm going to read them to Doug at the end of the presentation. We'll have a little Q&A time at that point. You can place those questions at any point throughout the presentation, just so you don't forget what you wanted to ask. And without further ado, Doug, I'll turn over the presentation to you.
Thanks, Nate. Well, welcome everybody. Today we'll be talking about the numismatic legacy of the English Civil Wars, an interesting period, and for me particularly interesting because it is a time when the coinage really reflects what's going on in the country. So the English Civil Wars lasted from basically 1642 to 1653. There was 3 phases of it, and we'll be talking about the coinage that appeared during that time. But to start with, money is anything that people will accept as payment in exchange for goods and services. It had many uses over the ages beyond its original development for long-distance trade and military power. Among them is the use of money as a means of communication through their designs and legends. A nation's money is often the first impression a visitor gets of the nature of a country, and as such, the designs and legends that are placed on it have always been considered important by the authorities responsible for issuing them. Ever since the successors of Alexander the Great began to elaborate the legends and images used on their coins as a means of enhancing their personal fame and glory, coins have been used as a means of conveying political meaning, propaganda. For simple declarations of independence and power to more subtle messages conveying complex political concepts, early modern European coins reflect the legacy left by the ancient world in a rich numismatic pageant. And the coins of the English Civil War are a perfect example of this. So the English Civil Wars led to the trial and execution of Charles I, the exile of his son Charles II, and the replacement of the English monarchy with the Commonwealth of England from 1649 to 1653, and then the Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell from 1653 to 1659. The monopoly of the Church of England on Christian worship in England came to an end, and the victors consolidated the already established Protestant ascendancy in Ireland. Constitutionally, the wars established a precedent that British monarchs could not govern without the consent of Parliament, although this would not be cemented until the Glorious Revolution in 1688. So there are a lot of momentous changes, and these changes are reflected, and we'll see that in the next slide as we start looking at the coinage. So before the start of the Civil Wars, English coinage had a standardized appearance that had developed during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I and was continued under James Stuart, James VI of Scotland, or James I of England. The monarch's portrait appears on the obverse along with a denomination marked in Roman numerals and the legend in Latin giving the monarch's names and titles. The reverse held the arms of England, Ireland, and Scotland, and various mottos. Charles I introduced the motto on his coinage of Christo auspice regno, I rule under the auspices of Christ, reflecting his belief in the concept of the divine right of kings. In this case, an ill-omened motto, if there ever was one, considering the results. But you'll see here the various coins for the smaller denominations, such as the 3 pence and the shilling and 6 pence, you had a standard portrait of the king and their standard titles. On the reverse, you have the shield. So we'll get a closer look at some of these. Here's your silver shilling of the time. The typical example of Charles I's early coinage. He's shown with his crown and in clothing of the style of the time. At that point, the large ruffs were in style, something that was held over since Elizabethan times, and a cape, a stole that was often made out of fur and all that. The message is basically Charles Charles, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland. The reverse features the arms of Great Britain, a quartered shield with the arms of England at the upper left and lower right, and the Lion of Scotland in the upper right, and the Harp of Ireland in the lower left. The legend reads, "I reign under the auspices of Christ," as I said earlier. And then you would have various marks that would tell you the mark of the pix, which would give you the date range, because at this point the coins are not dated. Notice that the legend is in Latin. There's a Latin numeral behind the head of the king. That's 12 for 12 pence, which equals 1 shilling. 12 pennies equal a shilling at the time. And we'll go on to the next coin. The standard design for Charles's larger coinage featured the same legends, but instead of the king's portrait, the king was depicted in full armor, armored char with sword drawn, basically showing the majesty of the king and his power. This obverse design was to continue in use for the rest of the reign, except for changes in the legend that were to appear during the Civil War. So other than the obverse image, the design is essentially the same, with minor variations in the shield and things of that sort. Here we have one of his gold coins. Now this is a unite, or a 20 shilling coin, which reads, "Through concord, kingdoms flourish," on the reverse, in reference to the joining of the crowns of Scotland and England. A prophetic statement, perhaps? We will see in the course of the war. Now, in this case, instead of the Roman numeral standing for pence, it stands for shillings, 20 shillings being equal to £1, which is what a unite was in value. Now, interestingly, as Charles began his reign, he was fairly popular. There was a question mark because his wife was a Catholic, and so people weren't sure what to think of that. They were worried that Charles would be influenced unduly by Catholic interests, something that was a major consideration because of the hard times that had occurred under Elizabeth and the distrust that the Protestants in England had of the Catholic Church. This medal is interesting because it's from the earlier period of his reign, basically halfway between the time when he became king in 1625 and the time of the start of the Civil War. So in 1633, Charles, who was Scottish, the Stuarts were the Scottish royal house, and James I was the first of them to be in charge of England. But Charles had not been crowned in Scotland. He'd been crowned in England, but he neglected to take the time to go up to Scotland and get crowned. So in 1633, he went to Edinburgh for the official crowning. This medal was produced to celebrate his return to London from this visit. And it's an interesting view of what was going on at the time. The obverse features Charles in armor, full of confidence, mounted on a fine charger, traveling over a field made up of thistles, roses, and shamrocks, which represent the kingdoms under his rule. The legend reads, "Charles, august and undefeated ruler of Great Britain, France, and Ireland." The reverse shows a rare image of pre-Great Fire London under a clouded sky in which the sun has just broken out in joy over the return of Charles to his capital. The legend reads, "The sun only shines on the city when the king illuminates it." So a very positive and upbeat image, quite in contrast with what would be happening a few years later. This is at a time when Charles is still fairly popular. There's still some questions. He's reluctant to call Parliament into session because he needs money and is having trouble with that. But generally speaking, the country is okay, except for the highest levels of leadership. Now, the interesting thing is that this image on the reverse does show a pre-Great Fire picture of London. So the buildings, several of the major buildings would be gone, as are most of the minor buildings. There would be quite a bit of change that you would see. So this is a rare image of what London would have looked like in this, from the south side of the Thames at this date. The Great Fire in 1666 changed that scene quite a bit. You get a closer look at it. Really detailed, beautiful metal. Now, during the Civil War, both sides had to figure out what they were going to do about issuing coins, and in particularly, since Charles did not get control of London, and the Tower of London was where the major mint of the nation was, Parliament managed to control that and kept control throughout the war. So Charles was forced to use other mints. Shrewsbury was actually in existence before the war, but the other mints had to be created on the fly, which gave the Parliament an advantage, since most of the engravers and skilled workers were located in London, and most of them stayed with their work in London. So Charles had to make do quite a bit. Now, once the Civil War started, interestingly, the royalists, Charles was the one who changed his designs. So soon after the war started, Charles introduced a new type of coinage at his mints, most notably at Shrewsbury, which already existed, and at Oxford. That gave his war aims. Oxford was his capital. So these coins were designed to state clearly why he was fighting against Parliament, what his reasons were. The obverse image on these coins is the standard armed and mounted figure of the king used for larger silver denominations. On the smaller denominations, you had the bust of the king as usual. What changed was that the image on the pound, for example, is the king in arms and armor and trampling on basically trophies of war. The legend is standard on the obverse: Charles, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, etc. But the reverse features a cartouche with the legend Religio Protestantium Legis Angliae Libertas Parliamentiae. The Protestant religion, the English law, the liberty or freedom of Parliament, with a legend around Exurgat Deus dissipentur enemici. Let God scatter my enemies. Charles claimed to be defending the traditional order of things and asserted that God was on his side. So his argument was he was just following tradition, that he wasn't breaking any of the laws or changing any of the precedents. He was just trying to rule the country, and it was Parliament that was at fault for not cooperating with the king and allowing him to run the country with enough money through taxes, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an interesting argument. The king is claiming to be traditional and doing what is right and legal. Obviously, Parliament did not agree with but we'll look at some of these coins in a little bit more detail first. So here we have the silver pound. Now, this is an innovation. It's a very large and heavy coin. It's worth 20 shillings, which is what a pound was. So it was very impressive, and it reflects the need for an impressive coin to distribute. Also, it reflects a shortage of gold and the need to make large payments, because the crown was forced to import weapons and also pay for mercenaries to some extent. And to do so, it was important to have larger denomination coins. Since there was a shortage of gold available, they used silver at times, including producing this large and impressive coin. You can see that Charles is armored and holding his sword forward. Below you have arms and armor, including helmets, spears, swords, and flags that are being trampled on by his charger. And behind him you have the mint mark for Shrewsbury. The denomination actually appears on the reverse, under the crown with the 3 feathers of Wales. We also have another innovation in the coinage, the gold triple unite. So it's a 60 shilling coin, or £3. And this is also another impressive coin, more than 40 millimeters, with the standard message on the obverse. The king is shown with his sword drawn, and also a laurel branch for he's got war and peace in his hands. He can offer either depending on how his enemies react. And he's got the standard exergat Deus dissipentur inimici, for God will disperse his enemies. The Roman numerals stand for £3 in this case. So the denomination that they're representing is different, but that's 60 shillings. It was clear to people at the time. Now you've got the shilling. This is the type of coin that people would have seen much more often. Now, this is the parliamentary coinage. What's interesting is, so the Parliament doesn't change the coinage at all. This coin looks very much like the coins that were issued before the war. That was a point that they were making. Parliament was fighting for a different principle, so they could hardly disagree with the king's war aims, which were, after all, very traditional. They didn't want to be saying that they were the revolutionaries, that they were changing things and creating a ruckus by breaking laws or changing laws or changing traditions. So Parliament claimed to be fighting on behalf of the traditional order and to free the king from his evil, read Catholic, counselors. Since they did not claim to be in revolt, they were very careful to follow, to the extent possible, traditional protocol. This included keeping the coinage exactly as it had been before the war. Parliament had the great advantage of controlling London, the site of the Tower Mint, by far the largest and most productive mint in the country, and home to nearly all of the skilled coin engravers. And so you see, the only difference is the mark of the Picts that tells you what years the coins would have been produced in. Otherwise, they look just like the coins previous to the start of the wars. And here you have an example of a crown, same situation. So Christo auspici regnos, Charles rules under the auspices of Christ and his titles and everything else. So you would think that everything was hunky-dory, normal, and not a problem. But the news of the day would tell you differently as the fighting continued, with at first the royalists gaining the ascendancy, and then gradually the parliamentarians slowly gaining more and more control of the country. Now, after the war, after the initial series of wars in 1649, Charles was defeated. He refused to negotiate in any way. He right to the very end claimed that he was God's representative on earth, and what he said goes, because he represented God and he was speaking with the voice of God. So giving up any of his power would have been a slap in the face, not only to himself, but to God. That was not a very flexible position to be in. And eventually, Oliver Cromwell and Parliament got tired of trying to negotiate with Charles, and in the end decided to execute him. At that point, England became a Commonwealth, which is basically a republic, with the execution of Charles I and the elimination of the monarchy. If you're going to kill the king, it's best to get rid of the family and the monarchy altogether. And within months, Parliament had introduced a new coinage representing the new ideals of the government. Most notable is the absence of a portrait in keeping with Republican ideals. So the denominations remain the same, but you can see there's a quite different look, and we'll look at these a little bit in more detail here. So you've got the penny, the crown, the shilling, a unite, sixpence, and half crown, plus other denominations. We'll start with a silver shilling. You'll notice there's no bust here. That's because the Commonwealth is following the ancient Republican ideals that everyone within a republic is technically equal. It's the republic that is the most important. And how do you represent a republic? Certainly not by showing an individual, because individuals represent kings normally. They're in charge. And what you want is something that represents the republic as a whole. Other Republican and Protestant features are the use of a shield with a simple cross of St. George. St. George was the patron saint of England, as opposed to the normal royal coats of arms and the use of, as opposed to the normal royal coat of arms. The reason why they used the cross of St. George is because St. George had been the patron saint of England since at least the 11th century AD, and it was a neutral image that could represent England without suggesting a monarchy or not a monarchy. So it became an ideal symbol to use. It was recognized throughout Europe when you saw the cross of St. George on the shield or on the clothing of a soldier, you recognize that they were English. The other thing that's interesting here is that we've got English appearing on the coinage. This is the first time that English appears regularly on all of the coinage. And the message is quite plain: the Commonwealth of England. The reason why they're using English is because of the Protestant aversion to Catholicism, and Latin, which was traditionally used on coinage throughout the Western world, was associated with Catholicism. It was a language of Catholicism. Now, so that became a big, important change. They also put the date for the first time on all coinage of the period. The date had been put on English coins earlier on a sporadic basis, but for the first time, they're using a date for every issue each year. Now on the reverse, you see change. You can't use the arms of England because it turns out the arms of England are actually very closely associated with the arms of the royal family. They represent an amalgamation of the dynastic arms for the different families that made up the English, well, Great Britain and the claims of England to France, for example. So they had to come up with something different. So they used the cross of St. George. And in order to show that, basically it's England, but they also are at this point claiming Ireland. Well, Wales does not count because Wales was considered part of England at this point. But Scotland would normally be on there, but Scotland was an independent kingdom. They were actually under the covenant at this point. They were independent. The English and Scottish parliaments were not together, and Scotland and England had not revolted together in the civil wars, though Scotland had been allied. Their government was now separate. So the coinage represents the coinage of England and Ireland. And it's interesting that when you look at the shields, the cross of St. George actually overlaps that of Ireland, probably meant to suggest that they were the dominant partner. And the message is simple: God with us. It's a very Protestant message, something that had appeared in Germany since Luther's time, Gott mit uns in German, but now they're using English, and it's God with us. The overall message of the coinage was to emphasize the break with the royal and Catholic past, as well as to emphasize the dominance of England within Great Britain and Ireland. Now, from 1649 to 1653, there was a lot of chaos that went on. It turned out that Parliament had difficulty ruling on its own. It essentially needed an executive. Without that executive, things got chaotic and increasingly got out of control. Cromwell, as the leader of the army, exercised quite a bit of power and eventually led a coup in order to make sure that the army got paid and retain power, but also in order to regularize the rule of the country, because things were getting out of control. And despite several changes that he instituted in trying to create a more flexible and easier to work with Parliament, he finally seized sole power in 1653 and proclaimed the establishment of the Protectorate. He didn't want to call it a monarchy or anything else. He didn't want to use the title of dictator because that had precedence with the Roman Republic. So by calling it a protectorate, he was protecting the Commonwealth of England. By 1656, after several experiments with different forms of government, it became clear that some form of a government with a powerful executive was the only solution. By that year, in 1653 actually, in 1656, however, he introduced a new design of coinage to represent the Protectorate, something that would indicate his future plans. Now, this design strongly suggests that Cromwell was considering a reestablishment of a monarchy, as many of his supporters had suggested, with himself and his family as the new royal dynasty. The coins were never produced in sufficient numbers before Cromwell's death to replace the coinage of the Commonwealth due to technical difficulties. They were introducing new mechanized minting equipment at the Tower and other mints. But these coins were intended to represent this new Protectorate as a permanent institution. So the obverse features a portrait of Cromwell, which is a very non-Republican sort of thing to do. Interestingly, if you look at this portrait, he's shown with a laurel wreath and a toga. I doubt that ever in his life he actually wore a toga, and the laurel wreath together with a toga represents a Roman emperor. So this image is very, very interesting. It's very clear that he is claiming sole power over the government. Also notice that the language has reverted to Latin, which was the language of the old Roman emperors. So here you have Cromwell very clearly taking on the role of an emperor, but with the titles of the protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland, as opposed to the king or the emperor of them. Now, so Oliver, by the grace of God, protector of the Republic of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The reverse features the crowned arms of England, Scotland, and Ireland with an English lion in the center, and the legend is Cromwell's personal motto, again in Latin, "Seek peace through war." So he's put on the reverse of the coinage his own personal motto. You've got the date, and then you've got this crown in the middle over a shield. Now, the crown obviously suggests a monarchy. He's not claiming the monarchy unless you want to call it the Protectorate monarchy, but he is absolutely claiming that power on the shield, over the shield that represents England, Scotland, and Ireland. And that lion in the center is interesting because it is also the lion of the Cromwell coat of arms. So he's definitely asserting the power of himself and his family to rule England, Scotland, and Ireland. Coinage can tell very clear messages if you know how to read them. Now, this is a beautiful coin designed by Thomas Simon, who is the chief engraver of the mint at this time under Cromwell. With the death of Cromwell in 1658, England was once again thrown into turmoil. Richard Cromwell, his son, was only able to maintain the Protectorate for 8 months before he was deposed by the army. The army was upset with him. He was not a strong leader. He had not actually been closely associated with the army. So they deposed him, and General Monk, commander of the English forces in Scotland, was instrumental in setting the stage for the restoration of the Stuart monarchy when he sent an invitation to Charles II, Charles's the first son, to come back to England, which he did in 1660, and the army supported him, and he had a bloodless takeover, and royal coinage was immediately ordered into production to replace all of the coinages of Cromwell and the Parliament. In 1662, a new series of royal coinage was introduced. These coins not only featured new designs, but were also struck by mechanical means instead of the age-old hammered method. The basic message of the coinage was a simplified version of the old standard. Charles II, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, the wheel had turned full circle, clearly marked in the coinage of the time. So we go back right to where we were before. The coinage is modernized through technical innovations, and the reverse is more elaborated, in part, I think, as a celebration of the restoration of the monarchy and to mark that renewal. So they kept the idea of using a date, and from now on, English coinage would be dated. So 1662 for this. And the shields are now separated, where you have the shield of England at the top and the bottom, again reverting to the old shield representing the family connections. So you've got the fleur-de-lis of France, the leopards of the Plantagenets originally, combined into the Stuart coat of arms. Scotland is represented on the right, Ireland on the left, each of them crowned, and we are back to the standard imagery that would appear for the next couple of centuries, with modifications in the designs and all that stuff, but the same basic concept. You have the two C's, which is the monogram of Charles in between the shields. And as I said before, the wheel had turned full circle. The monarchy was back, and back for good. This slide shows us a little bit about the symbolism that we just talked about. This is actually a beautiful coin. This is the petition crown, but it's a great piece to use to describe some of the overall symbolism of what was appearing on the coins. This is all important because this tells you it's all chosen very carefully and is designed to tell the viewer who understands them just what is going on, who's in charge, and what they represent. The petition crown, this piece itself, is a masterpiece of coinage. It was actually produced by Thomas Simon, who I mentioned earlier, in order to petition Charles II to accept his design and incidentally keep him on, hopefully, as an engraver at the English Mint, as opposed to the Rotier brothers, who had been brought in by Charles II to take over the chief engraver position. And his piece was a masterpiece. Unfortunately, because of his political connections, it was not accepted and has become one of the great rarities of English coinage, sort of equivalent to the $1804 in the US series. And you can see what all of the symbols work out to be here. The CC monogram for Charles II, the crown shield with the harp representing Ireland, the lion of Scotland, the three lions, Passant Gardant represents the Kingdom of England. And then at the center, the badge of the most noble order of the Garter, founded by Edward III in 1348, which was the oldest and most prestigious of English orders of chivalry and is given only by the king or queen to a maximum of 25 members. So this was put at the center as representing the highest of orders and enhancing the coinage. Now, to end the main part of our presentation, Charles was remembered with nostalgia by some. His faults were forgotten, at least officially. This is a medal that was issued. Initially, it was dated to about 1660. There's now new research that suggests it might have been issued a little bit later, perhaps as late as the 1680s or 90s. But it's basically a nostalgic look back at Charles. He's got his standard titles at the front with on the obverse, except with the addition of inglorious memory to the end. On the reverse, you have a landscape with sheep, but without a shepherd. So a symbolic. You're missing the shepherd to run England, and a hand from heaven holds a celestial crown. The legend reads, "Learn virtue from me, but fortune from others." So I guess a good message, if anything. So he was under this, he was a virtuous king, but he wasn't very lucky. And with that, we'll close the main part of this, but I wanted to make sure that people know that one of the things we have on our website is a virtual tour, a virtual exhibit from a physical exhibit we had on display for 2 years back in the mid 2000s, Coins, Crown, and Conflict, which was a wonderful display that had a great collection of coinage, English coinage, partly from the A&A collection, but mostly from Geoffrey Cope's collection. Geoffrey Cope was a major collector of English coinage who put together an amazing collection of English coinage of the Civil Wars, including a petition crown. And when you click here, you can see the web page where it appears. So you would go into the Money Museum, go to virtual exhibits, and you would find this page. What's neat is that you can actually go into all the cases that existed. For example, one thing we didn't talk about because they don't really fully, they're not part of the message of propaganda, but you can get an idea of what the cases look like. And then if you click on each coin, you can see the obverse and reverse, for example, of this Carlisle piece from the Siege of Carlisle. And the stuff that we see more often, the obsidian coinage of Newark. Nice half crown. But with that, I hope you get a chance to see this exhibit online. You can find it at money.org under the virtual exhibits as I showed. And with that, I'd like to end the show, and we can move on to questions and answers. Hopefully there are some.
Yeah, Doug, Joe had reached out earlier. It was about 10 minutes ago. So it was during the Cromwell aspect, that the slide you had. He was asking, he says, that is a king's crown, is the question on the Cromwell coin that you had highlighted earlier.
Actually, I believe it is a king's crown. It's not an imperial crown. But I have not looked into that in detail, so I'd actually have to look that up. But it's a good question. That would be an important differentiation to make, because they did recognize those differences. So it'd be interesting to see what that actually was.
I guess I've got a kind of a follow up on that. Then, if it wasn't a king's crown, what does he imply? Like, what was Joe? What was Joe implying? What else would it have been?
Well, the difference would be, the only two differences would be an imperial crown or a royal crown.
Oh,
So
okay.
royal crown, so being king of England, an imperial crown would imply turning Great Britain into an empire as opposed to just the Kingdom of England.
Got it. Okay. Joe, he did a follow up. He just said, I think it is after you put up the Charles II coin, it was the same crown.
Right.
So
Yeah. That's what my assumption was. But it was a good question, because I hadn't actually thought to check it out. The imperial crown is different. There's some different elements to it that you could see pretty easily. And we can go back and look here. So here's the crown there, and it's alternating the cross with the fleur-de-lis inside the crown. It's got a globus with a cross on top. And then if you looked at let's see, back, we have to go back a little bit to the Charles. You've got essentially the same one without the fleur-de-lis, but the same basic design. So, yep.
I wanted to ask you one more thing. Sorry. Yep. Remember how the whole two shields, it was that 1651, the English Commonwealth silver shilling. You had mentioned that they intentionally put one shield over the other to kind of maybe potentially showcase that they were in charge, so to speak. I can't remember exactly what you said.
Right. Yeah.
This is my ignorance, so forgive me to sound so silly. Were those hand done? Like, were those hand?
Yes.
Was that part of one die, or was it done on top of the other?
No, these are all carved into the die, engraved into the die. So this is handmade, and you could have just had the lines joining each other in that curve, but it's clearly the English shield is overlaid on the Irish shield, and that is a message that's intentional. So it's, and nobody at the time would have thought that Ireland was in any way equal to England, other than as a separate entity, but it's definitely dominated by England during the Civil Wars, before the Civil Wars, and afterwards. Now, Sharon, I guess, has a question.
Yeah.
Do you know how the people of England or of Greater Europe accepted some of the coinage as big changes occurred? For example, would monarchical European governments or businesses have questioned the Commonwealth coinage since it was so different from anything else prior? Yeah, that is a good question. Politically speaking, there would have been some revulsion to these coins, but in reality, there wouldn't have been a whole lot of opportunity. The English, during the Civil Wars and during the Protectorate, were very busy. Their military was costing a lot. Their coinage was not being exported to the European continent a lot. This is the period when they have the first Dutch war. So they're fighting against Holland, or the Netherlands, which was historically one of their greatest trading partners. So there was little exchange of coinage going that way. So basically, what you would have had happening is there may have been some revulsion to the imagery based on the fact that it's anti-monarchical, but people didn't worry about it as much at the time, from the standpoint of these coins are bullion. They're silver or gold bullion, and they would have been accepted, and they if the monarch had a problem, they would have melted them down and turned them into their own coinage, something that was typically done anyway. But when it came to the average person, you probably wouldn't have had much interest either way. As long as it weighed what it was supposed to weigh, which they did, they scrupulously kept the coinage at the right weight standards, basically because in order to maintain their trade with, say, Russia, which is another trading partner, which didn't worry about that very much, and with the colonies, they had to keep a standard that was usable. So it's a good question, because I have not actually seen anything where there was any concerted move away from accepting English coinage at the time. But it wouldn't surprise me if they accepted them and then melted them down. You don't find them in large numbers outside of England.
Did you see David's question? Is there any documentation that coinage was done at Bury Street, Edmonds, on a temporary basis?
I do not know. I don't have an answer for that.
And then there was, let's see, over in the chat, since Cromwell's power period was short, there is any known coin ever struck over Cromwell's coins where elements of the Cromwell coin are so visible?
I am not aware of that. That's something that you would expect to see, but I suspect. Okay, so there are enough of the Cromwell pieces that one idea was that they were just pattern pieces and they only made a very few of them. They made more than just a few, but they didn't make huge numbers of them. They were ramping up to produce more, but the fact that they were only able to be produced for less than a year and a half meant the numbers were limited. But if you look at the market, there are thousands of the pieces around, and they show instances of wear. But I suspect that most of them were set aside. And when it came to overstriking them, the Royal Mint at this point is not in any big hurry to produce coinage as fast as possible, which is typically what you have when you have coinages overstruck.
Yeah.
So almost certainly they would have melted all of the coins they could have got their hands on. They certainly recoined as many of the parliamentarian pieces as possible, and I'm assuming that the Cromwell pieces as well. But there, given the survival of these coins, there were people who actually did save them in fairly decent numbers.
Trying to think, I can't see anything else coming new through here, Doug. If anybody else has any other questions that they'd like to ask Doug in the chat or the Q&A, now would be the time. We definitely have plenty of time to still chat it up, but it looks like we may have exhausted the Q&A aspect of it. Shoot.
Yeah.
Oh wait, we got something else come through here. Hold on. Oh, it was just a thanks. This was excellent. Thank you so much, Doug.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for coming on this little journey to learn more about how English coinage of the Civil War could tell you something about the story of what happened. It's a subject that I find very fascinating. Another area is the coinage of the French Revolution, where you have the coins that very clearly show you a development from the King of France in charge of everything with standard imagery, just as you would see with the English royalist coinage, moving on to in very great detail show you the King of France under the law, but he's not the King of France anymore. He's the King of the French people, which is different. So he doesn't own France anymore. And then you have the different series of Republican messages where it's the Republic of the French people, and then it becomes the Republic of France. Then it becomes the Republic of France with the first consul, Napoleon. Then it becomes the Republic of France under the Emperor of the French, which is an interesting dichotomy, something like what was going on with Cromwell. And then finally it ends with the Empire of France under the French Emperor returning to the King of France, back to the old messages. It's interesting when coinage can show you history so directly, and if you understand the background and the symbolism of the coins, you can really rebuild some of the history, particularly with Cromwell, because Cromwell is often depicted in English histories as something of a democratizer. You know, he was for greater freedom. He opened up the electorate to larger numbers of people. And when you actually see the history and you can see the coinage, you can see what was going on was he was actually becoming more of a despot in some ways. Though, to give him credit, in part, it was probably because of the frustration of working with Parliament, which was unable, without a strong leader, to actually run the country. So interesting how the coins can tell you these stories.
Yeah. Joe had another question. Since we've got time, considering the siege pieces, is there an estimate on how much was produced?
How much coinage in general, or just the siege pieces?
I'm not sure if he was meaning all together or just siege.
Yeah, let me know what you're thinking there, Joe. I'll go on to David's question. Was coinage used in this manner during the conflicts among the German states? It was, to an extent, but usually they didn't have questions of whether or not to have a monarchy or not. What you did have was various elements of the same family or competing families putting out coinage with often subtle, in the sense that we don't necessarily know what the differences were, but the messages were there that were understandable to the people, at least the elites of the time, reading them. Plus, with the German states, you had all the changes between the fights between Lutherans and Catholics and Calvinists, or various varieties of religion. And in Germany, because the state, the principality, followed the ruler, so if the ruler was Catholic and his successor was Protestant, the whole principality would change. So you did have some interesting changes in coins and the messages on the coins for that reason.
Okay. Did you
but in general, to answer Joe's question, if you're talking about the siege pieces, there is no real estimate on how many were produced. I mean, nobody kept records that survived that I'm aware of, exactly marking down how much was produced. In the better organized sieges, the authorities would have tried to make sure they kept some record, but it was also not necessary, strictly speaking, on the transactional basis, because in most cases what you have is the authorities have some, especially in a town that has supplies of silver, because it might be a minting town, they would have some silver on hand. But in most cases what happens is, as the siege goes on, people need to pay, the government needs to pay the soldiers, the people need money to go about their daily business. And what would happen is people would bring their silver in. There was a reason why sterling silver was associated with plates, knives, forks, and all that, because sterling silver was the same quality silver, the same um, alloy of silver that was used in coinage.
Yeah.
So you could take your silver plate into the whatever the mint facility was. They would mark down how much you had turned in, they would give you, or you could wait and they would turn your plate into coinage, and there'd be a small fee for the transaction, but otherwise it would be done on it as needed as people showed up to exchange the silver. The government could also expropriate the silver, which wouldn't make people necessarily very happy, and you have to be careful of that in a siege, because you don't want some disgruntled citizen to open the doors to the enemy, which cause problems. But yeah, as far as the only numbers estimates I've seen are based on how many show up in the market, estimates based on how long the siege was, and just how many are seen today. I don't think there are actually any solid records that I'm aware of.
I think that would have potentially answered that follow-up question.
Yep.
I mean, yeah, if he has anything else.
So Joe did the follow-up. Yeah. Well, remember, the sieges they were for the crown or against the crown, but the officials on hand would have, if they were levying a tax, they would have kept a record of that, yes. But whether the record survives, a siege, especially an unsuccessful siege, the tendency is the records could easily be burned if the town was actually sacked. If they surrendered, that's a different thing. But any obligation on the part of the besieged authorities would be obviously negated by losing. So, I mean, there are records of sieges, but I don't know of any detailed records of how much they issued. Partly because, as I said, the silver is being supplied directly and turned into coinage directly. If it's part of a tax, then they'd have a record of the tax. But if it's just a matter of the families trying to convert their silver into something they could use to buy food,
sure,
there was less need of it because they would just convert it. Let's see. Anything else?
No, I don't think so.
Yes, the winner does write the history and also conveniently loses any inconvenient records.
Well, I'm sure I'm on the same page as the rest of the folks. I learned a ton, and if there's nothing else, I can't see anything else coming through. Doug, we'll close out the hour, if that sounds like a plan.
Yep. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and do come on to the website and check out the Coins, Crown, and Conflict virtual exhibit. There's a lot of really beautiful coins in there, and a ton more information about anything from the relationship of England to the colonies to stories of Cromwell and his death mask. So fun stuff.
Well, hey, thank you again, Doug. We appreciate you, and this was amazing and educational. So I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did, and we just thank you for joining today, and we hope that you will join us for future webinars. And everybody have a great rest of your day.